CBS News confirms California Senator Kamala Harris is significantly cutting and reshaping her presidential campaign in a bid to cut costs and boost her standing ahead of the Iowa caucuses. Our political reporter Ed O'Keefe obtained a memo sent to staffers and top donors outlining the campaign's plan to slash salaries and reduce staff size in its national headquarters and some early states, but redouble efforts in Iowa. And Ed O'Keefe joins me now from our Washington bureau with more. Ed, this is a really interesting development. Why is Senator Harris making this move?
Because if she can't place in the top 3 in Iowa, she's pretty much got no claim to continue on. Her campaign famously suggested last month, or vowed last month, that they would place in the top 3 in Iowa, which brought great pause and sort of concern to a lot of people who've been observing this, because she hasn't ranked in the top 3 in Iowa at all over the course of this, and certainly hasn't in the last month since she's sort of began to refocus and try to win over voters in Iowa far more aggressively. She, at this point now, will be moving staff from New Hampshire, California, and Nevada into Iowa, while maintaining a similar staff in South Carolina, another state where she thinks she will eventually do well if she's still in the race. And she's downsizing her national headquarters in Baltimore as well, sending a lot of the personnel into Iowa to help her out.
So should Harris's staff and supporters be concerned, Ed?
Well, you know, perhaps, because if you look at history, this has happened with other campaigns in the past who may have ultimately won the nomination but didn't necessarily win the presidency. In the memo that went out to staff and supporters today, they cited the case of John Kerry, who had to mortgage his home around this time back in 2003 in order to keep himself in the race, and he was able to break through and prevail in Iowa. And John McCain back in 2007, who at this point was hemorrhaging staff and down to very little money left in the bank, doubled down on a strategy that had him basically living in New Hampshire, helped him win the Granite State and ultimately the nomination. Of course, neither of those guys became president. This whole idea of doubling down on Iowa has been met with mixed success in the past. Chris Dodd did it back in 2007, moved his young family into Des Moines, ultimately placed last in the caucus. But guys like Rick Santorum and Mike Huckabee did it on the Republican side, and they ultimately won the caucus. But they, too, never won the nomination. So, if anything, this is a big warning sign to her supporters and to the field that she may now be in that critical stage where even if she pulls off something early on, it could be very difficult for her to sustain it over the course of the campaign.
So Senator Harris is still polling in the mid-tier. If a candidate like her is realigning her staff, what does that tell us about the state of other campaigns polling below her?
Do you remember yesterday when we talked about that article about Joe Biden
Yes.
that said that he is at risk of placing 4th or 5th and it could be detrimental to his campaign? And what did I tell you? That if you plopped anyone else's name into that story, it would be the same exact situation. Well, today the Harris campaign proved the point, that a lot of these campaigns are now in the final stages of making preparations for staff deployments, advertising buys, and other decisions on how exactly they will spend the next 96 or so days before the Iowa caucus. And people we've talked to in Iowa who work with her rival campaigns or who have monitored caucus elections through the years say that if you don't have your plan in place by November 1, which is Saturday, it's going to be very difficult for you to implement anything that could ultimately lead to you winning or placing well in Iowa and being able to slingshot into the other states. That's why you saw last month Cory Booker send out those warnings that said that he needed to raise a certain amount of money or he wouldn't be able to compete. What he was really saying there was he needed to raise a certain amount of money in order to put in place the staffing plan that he now has to continue campaigning in Iowa over the next 96 days. That's why you see Julian Castro making a similar pledge to his supporters that if he can raise $800,000 by the end of this week, he'll be in decent shape. Because if you don't have it by this Friday, essentially, you enter that glide path period where if you don't have your plan together, it's going to be very difficult to pull it off.
And Ed, one more before we let you go. With this realignment of the campaign for Senator Harris, what is, tactically speaking, the priority for her campaign in Iowa at this moment?
Just meet and win over every single Democratic caucus goer they can.
Yeah.
And again, she has to place in the top 3. Or we will all replay the tape of her campaign manager saying last month that we will place 3rd or better, and if we don't place 3rd or better, we won't be able to carry on. close fourth isn't top three, so
Right.
she's got to get top three. And if she doesn't, it'll be very difficult for her to sort of make the case that she should continue.
High stakes for her campaign. All right, Ed O'Keefe for us. Ed, thank you very much.
Take care.